Conditions may apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 120. Another Domino Falls. Midoriya? Shota asked hesitantly, hoping Takami there was no way he just saw what he thought he did. Ivy slowly and shakily turned around and looked at him with fear in their eyes. They didn't deny anything. They didn't ask him what the heck he was talking about like he so desperately wanted them to. Shota couldn't say how long the silence stretched out until Iwai piped up. What's going on? Is he dead? What happened? She was starting to panic. He should say something. He needed to say something. No, he's still alive, just knocked out. Everything's fine, Iwai. His brain supplied, working on autopilot. It felt like the words came out of someone else's mouth. Nothing felt real right now, and he couldn't take his eyes off Ivy. They were shaking. They were terrified. He forcibly wrenched his focus back to the situation at hand. This needed to be dealt with first. They needed to call the cops and get Iwai home. Normally, he'd just send her home with Ivy, but, well, he didn't exactly trust them to come back right now. No, he wasn't letting that kid out of his sight. Ivy, unload the gun and hand it over, he instructed, step by step. They were just going to have to do this step by step. They did as instructed, but they flinched when he held his hand out. Shota did his best to ignore that. Iwai, go with Ivy and wait in the alley here, behind the dumpster. I'm calling the cops. We'll take you home once they leave, he said, and they both shakily followed his command. As they left, he shot Ivy a look that said, make a break for it and you will regret it. If the way the kid's eyes widened was any indication, then he'd say the message was received. He sent a ping for the closest responding officer and waited, never once taking his eyes off of the pair hidden in the shadows for longer than a second. Izuku felt like he was fighting himself and somehow losing on both sides. His survival instincts were telling him to run. Eraser wouldn't hurt Iwai. She would be safe if he left her here, and if he used One for All, Eraser wouldn't be able to cancel it out before Izuku had a big enough head start to shake him off his tail. He could run. He should run. The tension in his muscles was practically begging him to, but he couldn't. Running meant losing everything. He would never get to see Uptown again. He would never get to see UA again. He wouldn't be able to say goodbye to anyone. He would have to cut ties permanently, or Eraser would find him. Eraser would probably find him regardless, and there would only be more hell to pay once he did. And he didn't even know anything outside of Mustafa. It's not like he had a passport or any means to leave the country anyway. And besides all of that, he had One for All now. He couldn't run. He had a responsibility beyond himself. His life wasn't his own to screw around with so long as he held this power. And it's not like he could just pawn it off on anyone. He should have quit the second he made up his mind about taking One for All. Continuing to go out as Ivy like he had was beyond selfish. What was he thinking? If he ran, he would lose everything and waste One for All. If he stayed, well, he would probably still lose everything, but the world needed One for All to be in the hands of a hero. As much as he didn't want to let go of it now that he was just starting to understand it, he knew that he would. Damn. He was going to be quirkless again. He was going to have to give One for All back to All Might. How was he going to explain this to All Might? How was he supposed to tell his friends? The more he thought, the more he felt like his lungs were rebelling against him and his inability to move. He needed to get out of here. His whole life was on the line. He needed to run, but he couldn't. He couldn't run. He'd made a royal mess of things, and now he had to deal with the consequences. Short Stack, what the hell is going on? EY asked as they settled themselves behind the dumpster. They didn't respond. Ivy, kid. She shook their shoulder, and that was enough to get them to look at her. They looked terrified. You're freaking me out, kid. What's going on? I missed something. What'd I miss? Are you hurt? I don't understand, she pleaded. It's fine. Everything's fine, Ivy stuttered out. Well, that was convincing. Clearly, everything's not fine. Why are you still scared? He's knocked out. You got him, right? Is there someone else? I don't. She trailed off as she looked around for a threat, but she couldn't see anything. The only other person out here was Eraserhead, who was glaring daggers at the two of them. Wait, what was going on with him? Why was he staring like that? Is that what Ivy was afraid of? Did Eraser go off the deep end? Kid, is it him? Eraserhead? Is he up to something? Is he hurting you? I can get you out of town. Just say the word. No, it's fine. He won't hurt me. I can get myself out of town if I need to. Everything's fine, they replied, hardly sounding any more convinced than they did the first time they said it. Cut the crap, kid. You're scared, and there's nothing else here to be afraid of except that guy glaring daggers at us. He won't hurt me, they stated again. Who are you trying to convince, you or me? Come on, the sirens are coming. Let's book it once he's distracted. No. The hell you mean, no? We gotta get out of here. He'll catch us if we try, but that doesn't matter because he's not going to hurt me. Everything is fine, they insisted for a third time. If everything's so fine, why don't you get that sentence out without stuttering? She challenged. EY, please just drop it. It's if you try to tell me it's fine one more time, I'm gonna lose it. I swear to God. Either you tell me what's going on or we're booking it. You got about 30 seconds to make that decision. Fine, fine. He's mad. I've been lying to him for a long time and he just found out and he's mad. EY took a moment to mull over their words. She hadn't really seen what happened. 1 second, she was burying her face in the back of Eraser's shoulder like a damn coward, and the next, Ivy had taken that sucker down, and that was that. She wanted to believe them, but they had looked so scared. They seemed to have pulled themselves together a bit, but that didn't erase what she saw. She trusted Eraser. She really did. But not as much as she trusted Ivy. Ivy was one of them, an uptowner. They understood this place more than Eraser ever would, but that was beside the point. She remembered how strung out and worried Eraser had been when Ivy had gone missing back in November. He really did seem to care about them. They were friends. Maybe that's why Ivy was so afraid. They were afraid of him being mad at them, not because he was a threat, but because that would mean they had let him down. That rationalization made more sense than anything else. Plus, if Eraser wanted to take Ivy down, he wouldn't have sent them away to deal with the police himself. Making up her mind, she reached into her purse and pulled out an old receipt and an eyeliner pencil, scribbled her phone number on the back, and handed it to Ivy. You text me tomorrow, or this whole damn city is going to be after him. You got it? She warned with a serious look in her eye. Ivy just let out a nervous laugh. I'm not kidding. You go MIA after this, then he's as good as dead, she reiterated. The kids' eyes went wide at that. They nodded and accepted the piece of paper without argument, glancing at it before slipping it into their pocket. Good. Shota's mind was reeling as he waited. He did his best to focus on objectives and not what had just happened. He was so scattered that it wasn't too difficult. He didn't have the bandwidth to focus on anything beyond making sure that the man at his feet stayed at his feet and Ivy stayed standing there behind that dumpster. Everything else was static. The sirens approaching, the words the officer said, the lights flashing were all happening somewhere else. Somewhere he didn't have the strength to concern himself with right now. As he finally made his way back over to where he'd sent the kid to wait, he saw EY walking forward to meet him, gesturing for Ivy to stay back. Eraser, if you hurt that kid, you're a dead man. She spat at him, venom dripping from her tone. What? He replied dumbly. I don't know what the hell is going on, but I know they're scared of you right now, and if I don't hear from them again after this, you are a dead man, and that isn't an empty threat. If I tell this city that you took down Ivy, you're gonna have to leave the country if you ever want to sleep soundly again. Understood? She barked at him with more resolution in her tone than he'd ever heard from her. Shota was so busy trying to pull the tattered remnants of his sanity together that he didn't even know what to say to that. Finally, he choked out a quick, got it, just as Ivy tentatively approached. You don't need to make threats, EY. It's fine. I told you it's fine. Ivy insisted with a stutter. Gah, that stutter. Even through the voice modulator, he could tell that was Midoriya's voice. The walk back to EY's apartment was tense and quiet. EY walked between the two of them protectively, and he made no move to stop her. He wasn't going to hurt the kid. He had no clue what he was going to do, but he definitely wasn't going to hurt him. They bid farewell to EY with no more than 3 additional threats on his life and an innumerable amount of pointed glares. As she finally let them shut the door behind her, he saw the kid's shoulders drop. He still had no damn idea what he was supposed to say, so he walked aimlessly a block or two away, and the kid obediently followed behind him. When they reached a suitably secluded area, he turned around and looked at them. They were shaking again, or still shaking. He's not sure that they ever stopped. There was nowhere left to run. He needed to deal with this now. A lost child. That's essentially what was happening here. He knew how to deal with that. Does your mother know you're out here? He asked. They let out a hysterical beat of laughter before they could stop themselves. Despite not being able to see their mouth, he could tell that they had just shut it abruptly. I'll take that as a no then, he answered his own question. He didn't know what was going on with the kid's mother beyond what Hisashi had told him. That and the fact that a conference had been scheduled to talk with her about everything that had happened and notably hadn't happened after the USJ. He knew the family wasn't well off, which made sense. if they had been living in a staircase for a time, and he also knew that she was concerningly absent in her son's life due to her current employment. Other than that, he had no information on the woman. He could certainly attest to her absence, though, if her son was able to sneak out every night for hours on end for the past 3+ years. For the past 3 years. 3 years. Midoriya was only 15. Shit, he was 12? There's no way. There's no freaking way. Ivy, how old are you? He asked numbly. Not that that sounded much different than his normal tone. 15, they answered. Are you lying to me? He shot back, hoping to heaven that the answer was yes. They visibly cringed at the accusation before answering, voice so heavily muted with guilt that it was hardly audible. No, sir. He couldn't help the grimace that spread across his face at the moniker. Ivy didn't call him sir. This wasn't right. None of this was right, and he felt like he was losing touch with reality. He needed to get a hold of himself. He was an adult, and he needed to take care of this child. I'm taking you home, he decided. Is your mother there? Their eyes went wide at that before they responded, No, 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 you can't. She's not home. When will she be home? He interrupted. The momentary fight they had left in them was squashed by that question, and they seemed to deflate with it. The kid's eyes started to water, and he didn't answer. They kept choking out nonsense syllables, but nothing coherent enough to even form a single word. His shaking was getting worse, and Shota wasn't sure if he was even breathing anymore. Kid, breathe. You need to breathe. He tried to remind them, but he's not so sure that helped. They just backed away from him until they hit the wall of the alley and slid to the ground, folding in on themselves. He could hear them crying quietly as they mumbled something about time, just a little more time. He was the adult here, so he did his best to pull himself together. He sat down in front of the kid a few feet away before he spoke. Looming over them wasn't going to help. Kid, you need to breathe, he repeated. He could hear his breaths come after that. They were clunky and forced, but they were there, so they'd have to do. When will your mother be home? He asked again. Any progress they might have made was immediately lost as the kid let out one ugly sob before stifling his volume. He curled in on himself and tried to force his tears to subside, but they didn't, and he gave up quickly. Never! She's never coming back! She's gone! He shouted as much as he could between shallow breaths. He had his face buried in his hands behind his knees as his shoulders shook violently with silent sobs. He took his mask off and tossed it to the ground. Shota couldn't see much in the dim lighting, but he could tell his voice was much higher based on the sound of his shuddered breathing. The sound twisted his heart painfully. Kid, what do you mean she's gone? What happened? She left about 3.5 years ago. She packed all her crap and she left. She's not coming back, he replied, the fight running out of him again as his voice broke on nearly every other word of the sentence. Shota could swear he felt his heart break into pieces. Zashi had said that Midoriya told him that his father allegedly worked in America, meaning that he didn't really have any idea where he was. Still, he felt the need to clarify. And your father? I haven't seen him since I was 7, he rasped out. It was muffled by his hands still covering his face, but Shota still heard him clear as day. He was alone. He was alone and living in a stairwell, or at least he had been. How long had he been there? Where was he living now? How had no one noticed? It had been over 3 freaking years. How had no one noticed? How had he not noticed? He was his damn teacher. He could feel his anger rising out of control. He needed to get a hold of himself. Now was not the time to be thinking about his failures. I'm taking you home, he declared after a full minute of calculated breathing. Don't have, no, my home. You're coming home with me. We're going to get some sleep and then we can figure this out in the morning, he clarified, not waiting for an answer before he got to his feet and offered the kid a hand up. It was strange to see his face. As hidden in the shadows as it was, Ivy looked at his hand for a moment before taking it and scooped up his mask in the other. He secured the mask back onto his face before they left the cover of the alley, but the tears and the shaking didn't stop. Any trace of Ivy was gone, and all that was left was a scared kid wearing a mask. After he was back on his feet, he refused to get within arm's reach again. He walked several paces behind Shota, and every time he glanced over his shoulder to check on him, he flinched. The implications of that were not helping Shota in his efforts to get a hold of himself. When they entered the light of the train station, Ivy kept their head down like a dog that had been kicked one too many times. They didn't look up at him once, but they followed obediently regardless. When the train pulled into the station, they took a seat as close to the door and what seemed to be as far away from Shota as they thought they could get away with. He knew they were terrified. He knew they couldn't help it. But it still lit a white-hot fury in his veins. Fury at their parents for abandoning them. Fury at his previous school for having let him slip through the cracks. But more than anything else, fury at himself for failing them so epically. In retrospect, the signs seemed so obvious. He hadn't missed them. He'd seen them and willfully ignored them for years. He'd let this child risk their life and go home to an abandoned factory for years. He had failed as a teacher. He had failed as a hero. And he had failed just as a decent human being over and over and over again. And now a child was crying and cowering away from him on the subway at 1 a.m. because of it. He wanted to tell them that he wasn't going to hurt them, but he didn't trust his voice, and he doubted the kid would believe him right now anyway. So he just sat there, watching them out of the corner of his eye while he tried to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do now. End of chapter.